Welcome at the second day of Connections, Conversations and Science Communication, the future of public trust in times of uncertainty. This event is presented by the Tresca and Rethink project, both EU-funded projects that in the past years have explored new directions for robust and trustworthy science communication in a future that is characterized by complexity and uncertainty. My name is Frank Kupper. I'm an associate professor in science communication and public engagement at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam and coordinator of the Rethink project. Yesterday, you were in the hands of Jason Pridmore, the coordinator of Tresca. Today, I am the host. We had an exciting day yesterday, and I think one of the main lessons was that a lot of the things that we talk about now, like misinformation or controversies arising in the public domain, are not that new. So we can and should draw lessons from history. Usually in science communication and other fields, we are focused on the innovative things, on new things. But actually, the problems that have been around for so long are maybe the important things that we should look at. Like, as we talked about yesterday, for example, that making connections to audiences is always relational. That science is always in the making, and therefore we need to think about how to convey uncertainty, how science communication can be honest and transparent. So those were the lessons of yesterday, and today we will focus on the question how people and organizations in the field of science communication and public engagement can take up these challenges. So therefore we will focus on reflection and transformation. And that is why I am so thrilled to announce the keynote of this morning by Dr. Elizabeth Rasekoala, Rethinking Science Communication, Paradigm Shifts in Transformation, Reflection and Practice. Elizabeth, so nice of you that you could join us today from South Africa. You are the president of the African Gong, the Pan-African Network for the Popularization of Science and Technology and Science Communication. Looking forward to hear you speak. The floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me clearly? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
You can hear me? Great. Okay. All right. Thanks so much, Frank, for that interesting introduction. And I'm really pleased to get a sense of the deliberations from yesterday. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to come on board with so many other commitments, but I'm delighted to be able to contribute to today's discussions and really looking at how we move from the issues that were discussed yesterday and the issues that we need to be taking forward today. So my title is Rethinking Public Trust in Science Communication, and how do we look at paradigm shifts of transformation and reflective practices. But I really want to start from the beginning to say that there is actually a problem with the title of what we're discussing over these 2 days. And the first problematic aspect of this issue is that we only seem to address this challenge of public trust when there is a crisis, meaning that we don't seem to embed it as what I would call a routine meat and drink, mainstreaming it into our impact measures of what we should engender in our good practices in science communication. In a sense, what we're actually saying is that it is not wired into the DNA of our practice. And so we carry on with business as usual. And as soon as there is a crisis, as we have currently with the global pandemic, guess what? We all start enthusing about the need for enhanced public trust in science communication. And that's a real problem. The concern here is that this crisis-driven approach, as I call it, would seem to suggest that we have an extrinsic short-term value that we place as science communicators on public trust. And really, some people would cynically accuse us of using it as a means to a specific short-term desired end. In this case, as we're talking on the COVID pandemic, as a means of engendering what? Behavior change, vaccine uptake, and so on, rather than as an intrinsic value in and of itself for sustainable science communication. So we really are in danger here with this crisis-driven approach of actually giving the impression that we're engaged in a cynical exercise. And that makes it even harder for us to engender public trust. We need to move from this state to a different paradigm. And the first pillar of that paradigm shift is that of transformation. What do we need to transform in science communication in order to engender public trust? The first move is the conceptualization and delivery of science communication within a social justice agenda in order to deliver transformative social cohesion, social inclusion, and engender the growth of cohesive democratic societies that are able to deal with challenges and issues of science and its manifestations in their everyday lives in terms of active, scientific, civic citizenship. What this means in practice is that science communicators need the paradigm shift of moving away from being ambassadors for science to becoming critical friends of science in their engagements with the public, so that they can transform their knowledge brokering role into one which objectively interfaces between science and society. In effect, this means that they should engage with the public in dynamics which challenge sciences and also science communication's presumed universality, objectivity, and positivism. And they should engage as advocates, holding up a mirror of accountability to science in delivering on its much vaunted promises of science for all and the so-called common good to all in society. This also includes foregrounding the ethics and values that should drive scientific advancement, and which beg the question, are the benefits of the scientific enterprise shared equally for all across the globe? Is there an equitable share of the benefits of science? And here I want to answer and situate perspectives on this aspect of transformation on the African continent where I sit. In the context of the COVID-19 vaccine hesitancy challenges that we have experienced on the African continent, as well as have been well articulated in other continents across the globe. Two regions, the Southern African region and the West African region, where a number of our colleagues in African Gong have been engaging on the ground with communities, especially hard to reach communities, to assess the real foundations of lack of trust and vaccine hesitancy. Very interesting, in the Southern African region, what we found was that one of the major groups that are very hesitant and skeptical are people who have been living with HIV/AIDS, which, as you know, it's a major problem in this part of the world, in the part of the African continent. And their skepticism around the COVID vaccine is very much centered in what I would call resentment and grievance, because they ask the question, why are we still waiting 20 years on for a vaccine for HIV/AIDS? We were promised. And COVID comes along in early 2020, and within a year, there's a vaccine for COVID-19. Does it matter who the mortality rates of COVID and HIV/AIDS are? So in a simple sense, they're saying if it was mainly people in Europe who were impacted with mortality rates and morbidity rates this high, would we have had a vaccine for HIV/AIDS by now? Very interesting questions to ask. And it goes to Frank's point about how do we then have an honest conversation with the public about uncertainty and risk in scientific research and what it takes to achieve results. And are these results and outcomes, are they based on race? Are they based on Eurocentric hegemonies as to who is impacted and who isn't? Another interesting dimension comes from our colleagues working in the West African region. Again, having these discussions about vaccine hesitancy. And what they came across was a similar resentment about the long-standing challenge of malaria, which not just in the African continent, but across the global South, impacts millions every year and kills in the hundreds of thousands every year. And we are still sitting how many decades down the line, how many, some people would say at least 100 years since the medical field has known about malaria and the causes of malaria. Why have we still not been able to, at the very least, have an effective universal vaccine for malaria as we have with COVID, and at best, eradicated malaria, which impacts millions of people across the world? So these two examples of what sits at the bottom of the COVID vaccine hesitancy in those two regions of the African continent is just really a snapshot that speaks to the question, the drive, the need for transformation in terms of how we can advance public trust. Because that means that we need to understand issues of social justice and how the public perceives scientific benefits and how they are distributed globally by race, by gender, by socioeconomic inequalities. And so the recommendation here on the transformation pillar is that we need to really radically reposition science communication. We need to shift the center of its interests from the brokerage of scientific knowledge itself towards addressing complex social problems that demand collectively produced knowledge, dialogue, and social action from the social actors involved and directly impacted by the problems in which they are immersed. We will find that when we undertake science communication in this transformed realm, we are then fully immersed in the zone of we rather than us and them. And herein lies the gateway to engender and sustain public trust. So that's the transformation pillar. In terms of the reflection pillar, what do we find? Scientists and science communicators seem to find it very difficult to engage beyond their comfort zones or echo chambers. Be it on science specialisms, we still live with a science field where, for example, physicists struggle to engage with engineers and so on. They struggle to engage with other non-scientist specialist fields. We still have natural scientists who struggle to engage with their social science colleagues and so on, and other social actors. And so when we put this challenge into the context of engendering public trust, it begs the question, how can we build trust with the public when we only engage with those sections of the public that are already enrolled, that we are comfortable with, that we feel are on message, as so to speak? And when do we make the move to undertake the real challenges of engaging with the publics that are not enrolled or are not on message? The refuseniks, the waverers, the hesitant, whatever labels we place on them. Surely this brings to mind the adage or the analogy here that you don't talk peace to your friends, you talk peace to your enemies. And I would like to give some examples here of how glaringly obvious and disturbing this challenge of moving beyond our comfort zone is. I'm sitting here with an analysis from a science museum somewhere in the global north that will remain nameless, that has been waxing lyrical about a 10-year institutional change, transition, reflecting diversity, addressing inclusion parameters. And in 10 years, it never occurred to them that they needed to engage with their visitors. So this institution that is patting itself nicely on the back and saying, look how we are doing, we're transforming, has engaged with it in a 10-year internal reflection exercise. And my then analysis and evaluation was to ask a very glaring basic question. Where are the voices of your visitors? And it was like, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. Oh, we're going to have to go and look for a grant to do that bit of research. And I just had to smile. I was like, wow, that's how hard it is to shift that paradigm of reflection beyond our comfort zones. We are happy to talk amongst ourselves. We're very quick to laud ourselves, and we're very quick to feel that we're actually doing what needs to be done. And this reminds me of the contribution from a lady originally from Southeast Asia in one of our UK programs many years back, who left me with a very, very long-lasting quote, and was basically saying, beauty might be in the eyes of the beholder, but inclusion is in the eye of the beholden. You cannot tell me that I am included. I have to tell you that I am included. And if we can just have the humility as a field to understand and to really center that in our reflection, it's not enough for us to sit and reflect amongst ourselves. We need to be reflecting with the very disengaged publics that we actually need to reach. We need to be engaging with the very excluded sections of the public in order for us to really engender public trust. We cannot simply sit with those who are already enrolled, the middle classes, the elitists, the elite of society, the well-to-do, and all the other intersectionalities of gender, of social class. So we know who's in and we know who's out. We know who is where the skeptics sit, and we need to have the courage and the guts to practice what we preach and go and engage with them. So the recommendation here is that reflective communication practices is what we need to adopt, but not just adopt them, but they need to question the deproblematized incorporation of scientific knowledge through favoring genuine dialogue with the public in order to understand and integrate their sociocultural contexts, perspectives, visions, and values of what the scientific enterprise means to and for them. It is not for us to determine that for them. We need to have the humility to listen and to engage and integrate their context, their perspectives, their values. And we need to remember, again, another adage that says, trust is earned. It is not freely given. We have no reason whatsoever as a field to be arrogant enough to think that we should automatically be given the trust of the public. There is no other sector, there is no other field that thinks in such an arrogant way, whether it is people in the legal field or in other fields of society. We all need to understand that trust has to be earned. As science communicators, just as any other sector, we have to work darn hard to earn the trust of the public. And therefore, in our reflections, we should realize that the public are usually suspicious of science and its communication for very good historical and contemporary reasons. And we really do not have to go far in the literature or mass media articles. Every week there is yet another story of yet another scandal in terms of lack of medical ethics or lack of scientific ethics. The public suspicion is grounded in a certain level of reality. And it is about time that we actually face that. Yes, there might be some issues about skepticism that might be coming from other aspects, but we need to at least give that fair due to the public, that there is a grounding to their suspicions. So in conclusion then, really the imperative of engaging public trust in science communication should be inculcated in our mindsets as a routine, please, routine folks, routine impact measure and goal of our practices as science communicators, and not as an added value or bonus, which we seek to only harness when there is a crisis. We need to move from crisis mode. The COVID-19 global pandemic has demonstrated very starkly the challenging nexus of conflicting interests in which current and future science communication outreach practices will be conducted. We're going into very hard terrain. This is the emerging nexus of political expediency and ideology and economic growth. But in a sense, as I said at the hands-on conference, we have been shadow boxing in this nexus for many decades when we look at the context of climate change and how the science has been undermined and discredited by vested interests, and this same nexus of political expediency and economic growth. The only difference with COVID is that the gloves have come off at last. And here the policy dimension to public trust is critical. And I'm delighted to see that that is on the agenda for discussion later on today. Because just as in our work as science communicators, the paradigm shift of holding science to account for transformation, we also have to realize that we have to hold the policy dimension, policymakers to account in terms of how they actually can enhance or undermine public trust. And in the response to the COVID-19 pandemic public health measures across the world, we have seen good and bad practices in terms of how policymakers have either enhanced public trust and really transformed the work of science communication and public health, and how they have not. So we're going into a terrain where as science communicators, we can no longer simply assume that the science policy making space is going to be walking step by step alongside us. Those days are gone, folks. Policy making and public trust is going to be a critical third pillar to our work as science communicators, not just in how we transform our practices, not just in terms of how we reflect, but how we engage to hold the policymakers to account. And so this challenging nexus really does make it an imperative that public trust can no longer be considered as a nice to have when we are dealing with crises, but should be an integral delivery and sustainable impact outcome of our work in science communication. And for this transition to happen, we need to transform our approaches, mindsets, and motivations from that of ambassadors to critical friends of science. We need to drive the interface across science and society for societal problem solving, which then inculcates the know-how and actions of the publics who are directly impacted by these problems. It also means that we need to engage with the publics that are most disengaged in order to better understand the road less traveled by ourselves, by science communication, and the challenges, opportunities, and strengths. And we will find strengths when we get there. The challenges, opportunities, and strengths that exist in these disengaged arenas. The real prize will only be achieved when we concertedly and intentionally move from a crisis-driven approach to advancing public trust to that of a systematic, fully embedded, and foundational framework through transformational and reflective practices in science communication, holding our policymakers to the front. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elisabeth, for this inspiring and empowering speech. And after those powerful words, I actually think we should stop talking and go out there and make this conversation happen. But at the same time, let's not waste this moment and talk about a few things that you have mentioned. First of all, as one of our viewers also said, this message is very important, that trust is about long-term relationships and investments, and we shouldn't only think about it in a crisis or when we have something that we really think people should accept. So, so thank you for pointing that out already early in your speech. One of the first things that you said is that we have to change our role from ambassadors to critical friends. And now this is not the first time that I've heard somebody say this, but apparently it's difficult to achieve on an individual level of all these enthusiastic science communicators that want everybody to love science like they do, I guess. What do you think is difficult about this move, this switch?
Thanks, Frank. I think the best way to help people to understand it is to contextualize what I mean in this context of the difference between what an ambassador of science is and a critical friend. In normal contexts, an ambassador really is somebody who is there to promote whatever a country or whatever entity. They're there to talk about how wonderful this entity is or this country. And an ambassador really is someone who only talks about the good things. A critical friend, and I would rather have anybody as a critical friend. A critical friend, on the other hand, is actually the better friend to have, because a critical friend is the friend that will stand by you when the going is good, and when you do good will tell you, yes, how wonderful you are. But the same critical friend will be the first one to tear a strip of you when you do something wrong. But guess what? They will still stand by you. So when we talk about science communicators being critical friends of science, we're not saying that we are not going to be supportive of science, but we are not going to be ambassadors of science, because an ambassador only has one script, whereas a critical friend is the real friend to have, because they'll be there for good and for bad. But when there is bad, they will call it out and they will still want to drive the agenda. That's the difference between an ambassador and a critical friend. And alongside that, we also need to avoid other traps. We need to avoid being propagandists of science. We're not there to be propagandists of science. And on the other extreme, we should not be apologists for science either. That's not our role. That's a whole different kind of situation. So for me, I think the best place for us to be, the most transformative place for us to be, is that of critical friends, because that's the most sustainable and that is the most transformative in terms of making our work as engenders of public trust much more sustainable and much more impactful.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It reminds me of my work on dialogue, and what I often encountered is that people said, if I'm going to listen to these skeptics, then I have to throw away everything that I believe in. So I think it's very interesting that you say that you don't have, being critical does not mean that you're not supportive of science.
Absolutely. I am first and foremost, and I have always said this, I am a critical friend of science. As much as I'm a scientist, I'm an engineer by training. I am the most critical friend that science will ever have. And I have and I make no apologies about that. But I will stand by what science is about. Are you with me? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Of course, yeah. We have a question from the audience, also recognizing this powerful message, saying it's also idealistic. At the same time, the harsh reality is that science is uncertain, evolving all the time, driven by various interests, also of investors. So what do you think a science communicator could do to, at the same time, enhance trust and also do justice to this process of how science works?
Well, the way to do that is, as I said, it's really about engaging with the public on science communication in a transformative way that is really about looking at complex social problems, so that we actually situate what we're trying to do as science communicators in the reality of the uncertainty and risk of what science is about. And we need to be very careful that we're not trying to have it both ways. Because on the one hand, and I go with the example of the malaria and the HIV/AIDS grievances that drive that skepticism on COVID. Here we are where we have a global pandemic that affects, predominantly people in the global north. And within a year, we're able to produce a vaccine. And yet we have long-standing diseases in the global south, mainly, that we are still not able to produce universal vaccines for. So how do we then explain the difference? On the one hand, we want to laud the wonderful, excellent, the magical stuff that science can do. Well, if science can magic a vaccine in 1 year, are you with me, for COVID, how do you then explain to someone who's been battling with HIV/AIDS for 20 years, or perhaps a whole billions of people in the global south who have been suffering with malaria for centuries? So that really is what it's about. That's where the public sits. We shouldn't be looking at it from where we sit. Yes, I can talk about how wonderful science is and my work as a scientist or an engineer and the things that science can do for society. But it's not about me. It's about how the person, ordinary person on the ground, wherever they are in the world, sits. How do they see the benefits? Is it really science for all, or is it a science for some? Is it science that is driven to solve the problems of all humankind, or only certain kinds of humankind?
So
and
maybe
that's
it helps
what we need to address.
if we zoom in on this example that you mentioned of the vaccine hesitancy in HIV-infected communities, because I would say that sort of the typical scientific response could be, okay, but you have to realize that developing a vaccine for HIV is something completely different than developing it for a coronavirus. If this is the only response, excluding the other aspects, the politics, the values, the unequal distributions. So yeah, I think it would be interesting to zoom in on what an honest conversation about this should look like.
Exactly.
Do you
because these are people who will tell you that, yes, they've been told you have to wait, it's difficult, it's complicated, it's challenging, blah, 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 there isn't enough resources. Well, exactly. And then these are the same people who within a year, there's a vaccine for COVID and you expect them to jump on board. And they have been getting a whole different message. Are you with me, Frank? Yes, for over 20 years. So, yeah.
So what would be a first step in this conversation? Is it appreciation or recognition, or what would be a first step?
I think the first step is really to understand how the whole narrative of scientific excellence and scientific benefit is not viewed in the same way by the public as we see it, and how we should be far more honest and transparent in our conversations about uncertainty and risk. Are you with me? With the publics in every part of the globe.
So there's another viewer that resonates with this idea of not loving science but questioning science. And the question is, could you share some ways of facilitating, enabling people to question science more critically and at the same time believe in its broader scale potential?
I think it's not so much about questioning science and then and supporting science or questioning science. And again, if we look at every field of human endeavor, whether it's, like I said, the law, whether it's the social services, whatever, every field of human endeavor faces the same challenges, the same contradictions, where you have an innate ability, a skill, and excellence to do good for society. The problem, the challenge is how equitably, how fairly, how justly do you deliver that? So what we're saying in a sense is, let's be fair, we're not just picking on science and leaving out the others. The scientific field is in no different situation from other fields. We could be having this whole conference about the legal field or other fields. But what we are then also saying is that we cannot have it both ways. We cannot, on the one hand, wax lyrical about how wonderful and powerful science is in terms of impacting people's lives. And on the other hand, we do not also talk honestly and challenge and hold science to account in terms of the inequitable benefits, are you with me, across the world. So what we're, go on, and some of the harm that science has been known to do. Sorry, go on.
Suppose that that the things that you mentioned now, that science communicators that are listening at the moment, they want to take up this challenge and they want to become critical friends. How can, what do they need? How can we enable them to become a critical friend?
Well, the first thing you need to do is rather than think that the public out there are empty vessels that you need to fill, is to have the humility to actually sit back and listen, to engage with the public and says, well, how do you, what do you think? So for example, a group that you approach, it's not about you going to them and saying, as our colleagues certainly went to these skeptic groups and basically said, we're not here to market to you the vaccine. Sorry, sorry about that. So, and they're saying, we're not here to market you the vaccine. We're not here to tell you how wonderful science is. We just want to hear from you. What is your perspective? What do you think of the science? Where do you think this sits? Yeah.
Go there and then shift the direction of communication. So you tell me your perspective. And you've also in your keynote you mentioned several virtues, I think. So the courage to actually go there and talk to these excluded publics. I think reminded me of a recent speech of the new Minister of Science and Education in my country, the Netherlands. He said, in response to this polarization that we see now around COVID, we have to stick together, we have to stand with the facts, which is actually us versus them again, and not the we that you are talking about.
Exactly.
You mentioned courage and humility. These are virtues I think that you need to train or develop for a longer time. At the same time, we think about these issues always as in a more instrumental way. So we need a toolbox or resources to build trust. What is your position on this?
Well, as I said, we need to move away from tick box exercises, as you say, because it starts from having that personal, individual commitment and sense of accountability. Because certainly what drives my critical friendship with science is basically starting from, seeing myself as a scientist that needs to be accountable for what I do in science. So I think if each one of us just harnessed our own individual sense of accountability from where we sit and grow that as a collective, wow, it would make a big difference to the science communication field. And that's really where it starts. There is no magic toolbox. There is no a toolkit. Yes, you can learn some of these practices. Yes, you can grow them within a community of practice. Yes, you can build up your confidence and your courage when you have a network of supportive colleagues around you, which obviously helps a lot. But at the end of the day, it starts from you as an individual science communicator, having that self-belief, having that self-understanding that I need to be accountable for what I do and I say about science in terms of how I engage with the public. So and that's where it starts. Mm-hmm.
It is an individual responsibility at the end of the day. I think that connects nicely to the next panel on reflective practices so personal practices and practices in organizations. But it's also a collective responsibility,
yes,
which connects to the role of policymaking, the last panel of today, and also a call that you made in your keynote. So maybe we can, at the end of this Q&A, talk a bit more about what we need from policymakers as a science communication community to let these practices grow.
That's a hard one. That's a hard one, Frank. Because as I said, with policymakers, we've had the shadow boxing. We've seen that on climate change. And in COVID, it's quite clear that the nexus of political expediency and economic growth is one that policymakers themselves are now openly grappling with. And it's going to be a difficult one because different countries, as we have seen across the world, have dealt with this nexus in different ways. And some have been more transparent with their publics as to the cost-benefit analysis that this nexus entails, whereas some governments, some policymakers have been in total denial. And at the other extreme, you've had policymakers that really have gone, the extreme of saying it's not really about engaging the public trust of the science. It's about what, a certain leader of the country believes or thinks. So it's a very complex and globally varied pattern that we see. And that's why I'm saying that as science communicators, we can basically start at a national level to have these conversations with our national policy makers.
So
and then obviously,
do you think the way governments operate has on public trust? So to what extent is this an issue for science and scientists, or also an issue for governments?
It is, because, for example, you have glaring examples, and again, I will not mention any country out there, where you have, a policymaker standing out there in public and justifying whatever measures they're putting in place and saying that, we are following the science. We are following the science. And yet, as scientists and science communicators, we know that they are not. They are picking and choosing, what it is that they want to do based on that nexus of political expediency and economic growth.
Yeah. And so, then again, the political conversation is not there or hidden.
Exactly, the political agenda, that's what I mean, the nexus. Whereas we know that they're not following the science. It's about the political ideology and the economic growth. It's about the economy, it's about inflation, it's about interest rates and the impact of COVID on the economy. But the policymakers do not want to have that honest conversation with the public. And then disingenuously, they hide behind the false science. So they actually use our science to yet again lie to the public And then we actually lose both ways, because it then makes it difficult when you then try to engage with the public. Are you with me, Frank?
Yes,
and
so
they're saying, but the government says, and you're like, but the government tells us that what they're doing is following the science, and you're telling me something else, and you're coming to tell me about the science. So it really makes us look daft at best, and it makes us look, dishonest at worst.
And this is also a responsibility, I think, of scientists to be honest about that there is a political dimension involved. We have reached the end of our conversation for now. Yeah. I'm deeply thankful that you shared all these insights with us, and let's continue the conversation. Thank you very much. For our viewers, there is now a break scheduled, and we get back on the program at 10:25. Thank you very much.